was Possible Therapeutic Effects of Illicit Psychoactive Plants. That was the title. So that gives you sort of an idea of the mindset. I presented my usual shtick on ayahuasca, and other interesting people presented. 3 weeks after that, I was approached by one of the people from the Stanley Medical Research Institute, and he said, saw your presentation, kind of impressed. We are interested in finding better medicines to treat schizophrenia, and we're interested in natural products. We've been looking at Chinese traditional medicine. We have nothing going in South America. Would you potentially be interested in applying for a grant? And so I said, well, yeah, what are the details? He said, well, we did fund $136 million last year in grants related to finding better cures for schizophrenia. So I said, well, sign me up. We didn't get $136 million, but we did get $500,000, and I was able, as a result of that, to spend about between 2004 and 2010 visiting the Amazon regularly, sort of reactivated many of the contacts I'd had there from my graduate student days in 1981, and we did this project, and we published this paper about it, and then in the process of doing that work, I ran into Sarah. We actually ran into each other in Iquitos at the shamanism conference that was put on by Alan Shoemaker in 2006, and she was there doing a film about traditional medicine. She wasn't particularly interested in ayahuasca per se, but we met and we hit it off, and I said, well, we're going downriver in a few days. Do you want to join? And so she came along, and that was sort of the genesis of this film. So we're going to switch. Focus here for a few minutes, or for the next segment, I guess. But just to put this in context, so this is Sarah, myself, a shaman, and Aku, may he rest in peace, who was our guide at the time, and we were in Pucurquillo. We went from Iquitos to Pebas, about a day and a half downriver, and then up a river, a short distance up a river called the Rio Ampiacu, the River of Poisons. And we ended up talking to this Curaca, this curandero in this Bora village. He's actually not a Witoto, he's Bora. But I just thought this was kind of a charming introduction. You don't see Sarah with face paint too often. She does get into it once in a while. But anyway, so we're going to kind of switch the focus, because I did want to do justice to the Philip K. Dick, overall theme. And so I'm going to do 2 or 3 slides of what amounts to shameless self-promotion here. And then I'm going to talk about the experiment at La Chorrera, which those of you who are Terry and Denny fans, you know all about, or you know of the experiment at La Chorrera, this rather infamous episode in our lives. And that's the Philip K. Dick part, because, Terence and I, went to South America in 1971 looking for exotic hallucinogens. We got a lot more than we bargained for, and there were a great many similarities between our experiences and Philip K. Dick's experiences, which he's written about in Valus and the sort of post-Valus literature. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And but first, I want to just mention this conference I helped organize last June, the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. This was a conference that was in commemoration of, and the next iteration was the 50th anniversary of a conference that was held in 1967 in San Francisco. Anomalously, or oddly, 1967 was, of course, the Summer of Love in San Francisco. But this was held earlier that year, and it was a private conference, and they published a book called Ethnopharmacological Research for Psychoactive Drugs. And that was the only thing the U.S. taxpayers, which paid for this, got out of it, was this book. It was a totally closed conference. One taxpayer that got their hands on this in 1968 was me. Somehow or other, this book, a tattered, worn copy of the Ethnopharmacological Research for Psychoactive Drugs, fell into my hands in 1968. The same year I got the teachings of Don Juan given to me by my brother for his birthday. So that provided an ethnographic and a scientific context. I was very excited by reading this book, and I realized that there was a scientific background, that you could actually approach this stuff from that angle, and it was very inspiring to me. And that really kind of got me started on my career in ethnopharmacology. And I've always wanted to do a follow-up conference because the government was going to do follow-up conferences every 10 years or so. Well, the war on drugs came along, and it never happened. So time passed, and then 2017 was the 50th anniversary, and there's been a lot of work done in the last 50 years.
Can we have the next slide, please?
I'm sorry, I keep forgetting to tell you to, okay, yes. And then the next one. Okay, and then the next one. Okay, I'll have to remember that. Right, I keep thinking slides are changing. This is what I'm used to. So we pulled this conference off, and we are publishing the symposium proceedings. We're republishing the original 67 volume along with the 2017 volume. It's a collector's edition, very nice box set, and that's almost finished. I keep telling people you can pre-order it here at espd50.com. We've got flyers in the front.
Get them on our way.
Yeah, we've got a bunch of flyers, so you can take a flyer if you want and learn more about it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. So, okay, so we're going to shift focus here and away from the scientific quest, which I really didn't undertake, to the, I don't know what you might call it, the metaphysical quest. A lot of you have heard about the experiment at La Chorrera. It's not really worthy of the name experiment. I would call it almost like the events at La Chorrera or the anomalies at La Chorrera, because experiments have to be replicable, right? What happened to us was definitely not replicable, and so it didn't qualify as an experiment. But here's the story. Next slide, please. My brother remarked one time, and I think it was very apt, he said, "We are part of a symbiotic relationship with something which disguises itself as an alien invasion, so as not to alarm us."
That's one of my favorite Terence quotes,
Yes.
really.
And in this talk, I'm going to be sort of arguing in favor of, was the experiment at La Chorrera a psychotic break? Was it some kind of a shamanic initiation or a shamanic encounter, or was it an alien encounter? And in this talk, I'm going to argue for that it was maybe an alien encounter. Next slide, please. So in the late 60s, my brother and I were immersed in this burgeoning psychedelic counterculture. But we were particularly obsessed with DMT. There wasn't a lot of it around in those days, but we found it. And we became convinced that DMT was more than just a drug. We thought that it might be a portal to hyperspace, hyperspatial dimensions, and possibly alien contact. We called DMT the secret. Now, I'm not going to defend loose thinking. There was plenty of that going on. And, you know, we wanted to believe, right? But next slide, please. So we called it The Secret, and we were ready to go after it. In 1971, we set out for La Chorrera, which was a tiny mission village in the Colombian Amazon, together with 3 similarly obsessed friends, mostly from Berkeley, Terence's friends from classes he was sharing. The reason we went to La Chorrera was that it was the ancestral home of the Witoto people, and they were the ones who had been reported to possess a drug called ukuhe that was an orally active form of DMT. And this is why we were interested in it, because we thought that being orally active, it might last longer. Next slide, please. Oops. And so we thought, wait a minute, yeah, we thought that this oral activity might prolong the effect. Are we on the right? Yeah. And this would enable us to see and communicate with the little people, as the Witoto called it. So right there are similarities to alien encounters, right? Next slide, please. So what we went looking for at La Chorrera was this. One of several species, Varrola theodora. There are many Varrolas in the Amazon, many species, and many of them are used as snuffs by different tribes. Not the Witoto, but the Yanomami and other tribes, because the sap of Varrolas are very high in tryptamines, mostly DMT and 5-methoxy DMT. So the Witoto prepared an orally active preparation from this, which they called ukuhe. Rather than boiling the sap down to a powder and mixing it with acid, they made a paste out of it. It was reputed to be extremely strong, extremely rapidly acting, and to essentially transport you into another dimension. This is what we were going for. You know, I mean, maybe I should digress a little and say, you know, we were not really looking for, at the time, both Terence and I were science fiction nuts, you know, freaks, you might say. Still am. I'm still very into it. But, you know, we weren't looking for something spiritual. We were looking for something that could actually facilitate a transfer to another dimension or open a portal to another dimension, however naive that idea might be. But that was, you know, we were looking for a technology that would do it. So we came to La Chorrera, and for various reasons we couldn't talk much about ukuhe to the local people. Primarily because we had been strongly cautioned by an anthropologist that we'd encountered on the way in, who said, basically, you can't go there and start talking about ukuhe. They'll probably kill you. This is like a huge secret. You're not, how do you even know about this, you know? And why are you guys here anyway? You know, not a friendly reception, and I don't blame him looking back. But didn't really matter because, next slide, please. When we got to La Chorrera, we said, well, we'll wait around and hope ukuhe shows up. But what we found instead, in the pastures, which had lots of cattle in them, what we found was this mushroom, the pan-tropical psilocybin mushroom, which is found in just about every tropical region where there are pastures and cattle. And they were very abundant. It was apparently the high season, no pun intended, at La Chorrera. And so we started eating these mushrooms. We approached them very cavalierly and kind of recreationally initially. It was like, well, you know, we can play around with these while we're waiting for the real secret to show up. They quickly made it clear that they were the real secret. You know, they quickly rearranged our priorities, might you say. And we were familiar with the chemistry of psilocybin, and we realized, yeah, this is the perfect orally active form of DMT that we're seeking. You know, ayahuasca is a form of DMT. It needs MAO inhibitors to be activated. We didn't even know that in 1971, but the mushrooms were there, and we got into them on a fairly, both casual and serious basis. Turns out the mushroom teachers, as we came to think of them, had a lot to teach. They had a lot to tell us. We became completely convinced that the mushrooms themselves, or an extra-dimensional, extraterrestrial entity, were telepathically transmitting. Oh, next slide, please. Sorry. Yeah. That they were telepathically transmitting instructions to us. Or more particularly, transmitting instructions to me. I seem to be the focus of the message, much to the bafflement of my brother, who probably thought he should be the one getting the message, and some of our companions who didn't know what we were up to, but getting increasingly alarmed by the day. Next slide. The mushrooms, if that's what they were downloading instructions, a blueprint of a way to use sound, mushrooms, and our own DNA to transform ourselves into superconducting, holographic, hyperdimensional entities that were fusions of matter and mind, an artifact controlled by thought, whose capacities were limited only by the imagination. Essentially, the ultimate biotechnological artifact. The UFO, the Philosopher's Stone, the resurrection body, the logos externalized, the transcendental object at the end of time. All of these phrases have been used to describe what we thought we were trying to build. And that is what this experiment, had it succeeded, would have created. Next slide, please. But of course, the experiment did not succeed, because it could not succeed without violating just about every physical law in the universe. Next, please. Advance. Yeah, so this is where it gets a little tricky. The experiment did have a spectacular effect, though. Next. After performing the experiment, I became dislocated, this might be the kind way to say it, in space-time for about 14 days. Next. My consciousness became co-contiguous with the boundaries of space-time. That was my perception, anyway. Next. Terence became hypervigilant and did not sleep for 14 days. Next. During that time, the elements of the time wave theory were downloaded to him. Next. Followed by a spectacular and utterly absurd UFO encounter. For only him. Don't get ahead of, don't. Next, please, next, yes. In which, I did not witness because I was busy cruising the cosmos. I was certainly not focused on La Chorrera and what was the goings on there. Next, please. Eventually, I found my way back to my home and back to my body after about 14 days, literally in this cosmic state. Next, please. Okay, so we've thoroughly recounted all this in Terence's 1993 book, True Hallucinations, and in my 2012 book, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. As well as, next please, our 1975 collaboration, The Invisible Landscape, which represented our really mostly misguided efforts to explain what happened to us in scientific terms. You know, what we didn't understand at that time was there really is no science that could explain what happened, but we were taking a shot at it. Yes?
Who is older, you or Dennis? Or Terence?
Up here?
Yeah.
Who do you think? I'm younger. I'm the one with the binoculars. Yeah, he's about 4 years, or he was about 4 years older than me. Now That's the way it works. Yeah. I like this picture because it's sort of an philosopher gazing off into the distance, dreaming of crazy things, and I'm the guy with the side, binoculars, peering in on things. Anyway, it wasn't always that way. Next slide, please. So Terence was 24 when we ventured to the Amazon. I was a mere lad of 20, so we were achingly young and quite clueless, honestly, what we were getting into. We had no idea. But it's true that the remainders of our lives have been unfolded in the shadow of La Chorrera. We are haunted by the passing strangeness of the events that transpired in those mist-shrouded pastures. Terence passed on in 2000, still not having the answers to the overarching question. I soldier on and still ponder, what the hell happened to us? Next slide. Was this a prolonged dual psychosis, a neurochemical imbalance triggered by our excessive and reckless ingestion of enormous quantities of psilocybin mushrooms? Was it a plunge into the abyss of shamanic reality, a rough initiation into the dimensions that shamans navigate daily? Or was it an encounter with an alien intelligence, utterly real and yet originating from an alternate dimension outside of our ordinary conception of space and time? I've pondered all of these possibilities as well as others. I've come down to think, next slide please, that maybe alien encounter is the model that fits the best. The fact that drugs were involved makes it tempting to dismiss it as delusion. Yet, undeniably anomalous occurrences were witnessed by others there who were not on drugs. And typical alien encounter experiences, if there is such a thing, always have a signature that sets them apart from altered states of shamanic trance. There's a subtext that makes them seem deliberately designed to obfuscate and confuse. As though it, whatever it is sending the message, you think you're having an alien encounter, but it is much stranger than that. Next slide. So, was this a standard alien encounter? There is such a thing. Next. The experiment at La Chorrera has many of the elements of a standard alien encounter, or similarities with many encounters described in the literature. For example, next. There is a familial backstory, often related to childhood events or family traumas. In our case, family trauma. We were anguished by our mother's death, which had taken place 6 months previously to the day of the experiment at La Chorrera. In childhood, our dad was not the average guy he pretended to be, and so wanted to be to fit in with his peers. He was an avid reader of science fiction and Fate magazine, and introduced us to that dubious literature early on. Our fascination with DMT, once we experienced, next please. In standard encounters, there's a siren song, something that inexorably pulls the contactee into the encounter despite its terrifying nature. In our case, it was the fascination with DMT. Once we experienced DMT, nothing else mattered. We had to investigate it and abandoned our careers, abandoned our studies to go to the Amazon, utterly clueless in 1971 to look for this ritual preparation. Next, please. There is also an element of the alien teacher, a non-human intelligence not only seen, but always sensed, with a message or information to share. In our case, once we got to La Chorrera and started eating mushrooms regularly, the teacher showed up and pretty much camped in our living room for the duration. We had a living room. We thought of it as the teacher, more like the alien who came to dinner, and most nights was dinner. Next, please. Lost time. The encounters and alien encounters seem to occur in a timeless realm. Contactees report returning to reality hours, days, weeks sometimes after their encounters, often with little or no memory or confused recollections of what has occurred. In our case, as we approached the moment to perform the experiment at La Chorrera, there was a concrescence of anomalous phenomena in the environment, a series of time, a sense of time dilation, as though approaching a singularity. We explained all this as a shock wave from the future. This was a predicted effect, confirmation that hours ahead we had performed the experiment, and it had succeeded. After the experiment, time remained distorted for many days. I was lost in space-time. There was no now for me. I was smeared across all time. Terence was obsessively anchored in a timeless now. Our only connection to real time was the first crow of the cock at dawn every morning. It represented the threshold, the gradual condensation back into ordinary space and time. Next, please. Transformative, psychic or physical modifications. Probes inserted into the brain or anus. Objects implanted in the body. Similar phenomena is also seen in shamanic initiations. This is a common theme of alien encounters. The person is changed, the person is transformed, something is left in the body, or some sort of medical procedure. Yeah. Yeah, next, please. Sorry. Okay. In our case, this process was not done to us. We were given instructions on how to perform this fourth dimensional surgery on ourselves. How to use sound, mushrooms, tryptamines, and DNA to trigger a kind of metamorphosis into hyperspatial, yet still biological entities. Themes and elements of insect metamorphosis, as well as alchemical transformation, were prominent in our delusional, quote, unquote, experimental protocol. I was given a protocol. Next, please. Yeah. I was given a protocol for performing the experiment, insights into a model of drug action that was nothing like what we now understand it to be, but that made a kind of crazy sense in the context of the experiment I was about to perform. And in the days following the experiment, Terence did not sleep. Instead, he began to construct the prototype of what later became the time wave, an odd, quasi-mathematical construction based on the I Ching that he claimed described the structure and texture of time and could be used to measure the ingression of novelty into the continuum. He continued to elaborate, investigate, and defend the time wave for decades after the experiment. The time wave had the baffling novel character of an alien artifact. No one but Terence really knew what to do with it. In the end, I'm not sure Terence knew what to do. Next.
Next slide.
So in that sense, gifts are given. The contactee is given information, knowledge, or power. Another gift of La Chorrera was not extra-dimensional or anomalous in any way, but perhaps was the most important. One thing we brought back from La Chorrera and shared with the world were spores of the mushrooms. Over the next couple of years, we developed a simple method to grow the mushrooms and published a small pamphlet about it and shared that with the world. This had real impact. It opened these dimensions to consensual exploration. From the perspective of the alien invaders, this was the stealth weapon, and it worked. Mushrooms are now widely cultivated and easily available. They have taken over the world and formed symbioses with many humans. And most humans don't even realize it yet. This is the best kind of invasion. Next slide. Next, please.
Next, please.
The other thing that characterizes alien encounters is the absurd. The immediate aftermath of the experiment at La Chorrera for us was funny, peculiar, and shot through with puns, silly jokes, and non sequiturs, as mushroom experiences often are. At one point, I proclaimed that our script was being written by James Joyce. And later, Terence's encounter with the UFO, which only he saw, was another absurdity because the saucer was a fake photograph of a UFO made from a surgical lamp that was claimed by contactee and hoaxer George Adamski. And yet, here it was, manifesting, a joke from the collective unconscious. Subtext there, I don't know. And next, please. And then post-encounter confabulation, an attempt to explain what happened. Obsessive efforts to explain, loss of credibility in the eyes of friends and colleagues, a vague, persistent sense of unreality. Things are not what they seem. In our case, Terence was shocked and dismayed at the skepticism of his friends in Berkeley when he returned from La Chorrera in May of 1971. So shocked, in fact, that he turned around and went all the way back to La Chorrera, only to be disappointed again. There were no more mushrooms. The magic was gone. He spent much of the rest of his life telling the tale, sincerely convinced that he was the symbiote of a chosen ambassador of a benign race, or the chosen ambassador of a benign race of extraterrestrial mushrooms, or whatever intelligent beings were communicating through them. Who's to say he was wrong? So, our experiment at La Chorrera on many levels meets all the criteria of an alien encounter. You can tick the boxes. Next, please. Just a little bit of family backstory on how we got into this. My father was a remarkable fellow. He was of the post-war generation. When he came back from the war, he just wanted to fit in. Typical family white picket fence sort of agenda. But he was more bookish than most of his friends. He was more of an intellectual. And because he was sickly as a child, and he read a lot of science fiction. Next slide, please. He was particularly fond of Fate magazine. UFOs and aliens were a constant theme, also, apparently, scantily clad blondes. Occasionally, Fate magazine reported on mescaline and magic mushrooms. I don't know if he ever noticed this, because when we started working with psychedelics as rebellious young man, he was so adamantly against it. And yet, these magazines were here, like these ones at the top. You can read it, In the Magic Land of Mescaline. The other one is, Quest for the Sacred Mushroom. The one on the right is, the Peruvian soul drug. I wonder what that could be. And these were published in the 50s, and he was reading fake magazines, so he had to have noticed. Maybe he never read them or dismissed them. Next slide, please. Fate magazine is still very much around. It's published in Minnesota, not far from where I live. And in 2006, I was invited to contribute an article on mescaline for their Peyote anniversary edition, which I did. And that was great fun. It's called Mescaline, A Molecular History, which you can probably find online. Next slide, please. This may be familiar with you. Psilocybin and the Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide is the small book we published in 1975 using the spores we brought back from La Chorrera. And we discovered a simple way to grow the mushrooms, and we shared this with the world. Simple enough for any nerdy 10th grader, maybe 7th graders a little young, but any nerdy 10th grader could master this process, and many did. And it was like, we imagined many conversations, what's Johnny doing in the basement? Oh, I don't know, something about growing mushrooms. Oh, isn't that nice? And so many did, and we disseminated this technique, and that opened the portals to hyperspace for, for anyone that cared to go there. And we did that primarily because we wanted consensus. We were wondering, is this stuff that happened to us anomalous, only us, or do other people have these same experiences or similar experiences? Well, now we know, because mushrooms are very common. And yeah, there are unknown dimensions out there, beautiful, dangerous, and utterly alien, that anyone can visit on 5 grams or more. So, next slide, please. But life goes on. We have to live our lives and continue, to live our lives. I think of Terence and my life as pre-La Chorrera and post-La Chorrera in some ways. Well, La Chorrera was a long time ago, so I had to find other things to do. But this is my wedding and my father, Terence, in 1984. Next slide, please. And eventually life ends. Terence was diagnosed with glioblastoma, one of the most virulent and fatal forms of cancer, in 1999. He was living in Hawaii at that time, and this is a picture of him on the trail from his place in Hawaii. And he didn't last more than a year after he was diagnosed. It's a great loss. I miss him very much, and I think a lot of people who know our work also do. He's still very much alive in my own memory and my mind, and also he's achieved this interesting virtual immortality on the internet. So many people who were literally in diapers or not even born when Terence was at the height of his career were influenced by his thoughts. And I think that's just wonderful, because he's one of the most original thinkers of the 20th century, and also fantastically eloquent, much more than me. But I do my best. Next slide, please. This is just to orient you a little bit. This has been called the Devil's Paradise, the Putumayo. There's a great book by that name, if you have a chance to see it. I don't have a pointer here, but in this map you can see La Chorrera. I'm not sure up here. The Putumayo separates Peru and Colombia, and then 10 years later, when I was doing my graduate work, I went to Iquitos and downriver and up the Apiacu, which is the project I was working on when Sarah came along. So, next slide, please. So, that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. Thank you very much.